In Benford's law, we're looking at the distribution of the digits at the beginning of some data, right? In this data, this came from FinCEN. If you remember, several years ago, there was a very well-known disclosure of some banking data that was banks reporting suspicious transactions to the federal government, United States federal government, in case there's anyone who's outside of the United States. So looking at this data, we expect there to be unusual things in it. We're looking at the dollar value of transactions that banks believe are suspicious. Probably the most common way to approach Benford's law is the first digit test, where you just look at this first single digit. And that's what I've got here. So when we look at all of this data from all of these different banks, all of these different countries, does it follow Benford's law? This is what I think most people do. This is the traditional way to do it. So we can see, most digits are pretty close. 7 and 8 are too low. We can click on the 8. I built all this out in Power BI. We could use any tool that we wanted. I like the visual aspect. So, we see the 8s are too low. We could scroll through it and look through something interesting. The 9s are too high. We could scroll through the 9s and look for something interesting, right? A slightly more sophisticated version would be to use the Z-score for each digit. And then the Z-score would sort of prove out, oh, this digit really is too high or too low. So this is the traditional, I think, common way of approaching Benford's law.
Can you, while you're in here, for those that are still like, what is he talking about, this first digit thing? Can you show in the data what you're talking about? So it's numbers that start with the number 8. That's the one example. Numbers that start with the number 9. That was the other example. I found that to be helpful.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So when we look at the value of the transactions, so my first transaction here, that looks like it's about 1.6 million. Well, the first digit is 1. It starts with a 1.
So you plot the 1 out. So you say 1. We're going to plot that.
Absolutely. Second one is 50,000. Well, it starts with a 5.
Plot the 5.
Yeah, plot the 5. And a 5 could be 50,000, could be 5 million, could be 5 cents.
Mm-hmm.
As long as the first digit it could be negative 5 cents, actually. So long as the first thing that's not a 0 is a 5, we're going to call it a 5.
Okay.
And that's part of the thing that makes Benford's law, in some sense, almost mystically unintuitive. Who cares what the first digit is, right?
Yeah.
Except that it turns out it does matter. There is a matter.
And so what we're looking at here then is on your 1, we look at the 1 where it says 30%. 30% of the population that we were just looking at starts with the number 1.
Yep. And so what I've got here is a blue line, which indicates what Benford's law expects. Just a formula based on these guys who observed that some of the pages in their books are used too often, right? So we're expecting 30.1% of all of our records, of all of these transactions, to start with the number 1. In reality, 29.7% start with 1. You could say that's pretty close. There are a lot of transactions, so we might not be, we might want to be very sensitive to that difference. We definitely noticed the 8 more, though. We were expecting 5.1%, actually got 4.2%, almost a whole percentage point off. Tells us maybe there's some data that should have been down here in 8 or in 7 that now got shifted somewhere else, like the 9. And so the normal way to do this would be to say, hey, my 9 is too high. I click on it, I sort through it, and I look for something. Here's the upgrade, though. Here's what a more modern approach would be like. And this is what I did with my test scores, too. Because I don't actually think, for the most part, that people really care necessarily that the 9 is too high. I think a lot of times what people want to do is they want to find some route that's really off the rails. Is there a bank that's going crazy? Is there a certain country? Is there a certain date? So what I did here is I said, let's do Benford's law once for each bank receiving funds in this data. So I'm going to look for banks that are receiving suspicious dollar amounts and their transactions don't follow Benford's law. And one thing I like about Power BI, you can do this in Tableau, right, is I can make this interactive. We could just pick a bank from the list. It would filter automatically. There's a whole bunch of these different scores you can calculate. I think the most common one is probably chi-square. I'm a big fan of the D-score. Nick Green talks day and night about his MAD score. Doesn't matter which score we use. Just know that there's some out there. And so what I plotted here is the dollar amount of all the transactions, and then up and down, how close are you to Benford's law? If you're way up here at the top, you don't follow Benford's law at all. So what we see is right off the bat, the bank, well, actually, this looks like it's a country, United Emirates. Gosh, I can't even say the name of this country, United Arab Emirates. So this particular bank, totally far away from Benford's law.
Right.
You click on it, and in fact, what we see is 25% of their transactions start in 9. I mean, look how fast that was. We put it on the scatter plot, immediately could see which bank was the irregular bank. And I'll tell you, this pattern here, this is the classic example we look for people avoiding some kind of control. In truth, what there is here is there's a law that says if you're sending, I think it's more than $10,000 or $10,000 or more, you have to report that to the federal government.
Right.
So when you see too many transactions starting with 9, what are they doing? Well, they're coming just underneath that limit. Could not be a more picturesque example of somebody avoiding a control, and how we find it in Benford's law. And it's so much easier when we break it down into smaller groups instead of trying to look at the whole thing.